People often say the phrase, don't they? The phrase, it's all about perspective. It's all about perspective. It's all about how you view the situation. Two people can view a situation very differently. Sometimes we talk about the half glass full kind of people and the half glass empty kind of people. How you view a situation and your perspective on the situation can change how you deal with it, how you cope, how you understand what is happening around you and what is happening to you. This is it's the case in all circumstances, but particularly the case in times of suffering, in times of difficulty, in times of pain. I often wonder how I'm often amazed by people that survive real difficulty and pain and adversity without some knowledge that there's a God out there. I honestly, in a sense, I'm impressed because I'm not sure I would cope in that situation. But how you view your suffering and how you view your pain and how you view adversity and your perspective on it is totally changed when we know Christ, when we know God, when we know that He is at work and that He is doing something in us and He's doing something through us throughout all of life's circumstances. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because we've been reading about Paul and Paul's ministry and how Paul is receiving all kinds of criticism at the moment because over character, accusations, these kind of things. He's got opponents in this church whom he dearly loved, dearly cared for. And so this is a painful thing for Paul to be writing and to be dealing with. He's having to defend himself somewhat. And we looked at last week how those statements that Paul made about his ministry, about why he does not lose heart, having received God's mercy and preaching God's mercy, how they were open and honest in the presentation of the gospel, and how they remembered their enemy, their enemy that's veiled the minds of the unbelievers from understanding Christ, who is the image of God. And they were devoted to preaching Christ. They were devoted to proclaiming Him and not themselves. They were just servants for Jesus' sake. They were proclaiming Jesus and not themselves. And when we come to this passage, we get a wonderful perspective on Paul's ministry. It kind of transitions into talking about this is the gospel that we have, and this is the gospel that we're preaching, and this is what we are here to do. Paul transitions into talking about his sort of perspective on his ministry and on his sufferings. And this perspective, because if we were looking at Paul's situation, nobody would look at Paul. And this is part of the problem, that these false teachers in Corinth, that Paul will later dub the super apostles, in quotation marks kind of thing, they're all about strength. They're all about eloquence. They're all about looking powerful and victorious and all this kind of thing. And they looked at Paul's life and thought, he's not God's man. Look at him. He's suffering. He's getting battered around. He's getting kicked around. He's weak. He's got all kinds of ailments. How can he be God's man? He's not even that great a speaker. Paul said that himself in 1 Corinthians. He's not the most eloquent preacher. But yet here is Paul defending this and showing, no, this is why I'm of God. This is why I think I'm of God. And he gives a perspective on his ministry and on his sufferings that challenges our worldview. It actually challenges many churches' worldview today of what we expect and what we think the Christian life should look like. And when our lives don't look as we are supposed to, but as we hope them to be, Paul really challenges that in demonstrating that actually some of the things he's being accused of are many of the things that confirm he's God's man and that God is at work in him. So what we'll read about here is that we'll read about Paul's suffering. Verse 7 to 12, we'll read about Paul's motives for ministry as he continues through that suffering. And we'll read about Paul's eternal mindset in the final couple of verses. But all of these things for me encapsulate Paul's perspective on his life and on his ministry and why he keeps going and why he is God's man in this situation. So firstly, in verses 7 to 12, we read about Paul's suffering. And we'll read a lot about that as we go through 2 Corinthians. You read about some of what he feels, and he's going to list more. He's going to get very specific on some of the things that many of us will never ever face, but he had to face as his calling as an apostle. But he talks about his suffering and the death of Jesus being manifested in them. So we're going to look at that. So if you've got your Bibles, in verse 7 he says, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us." So he says we have this treasure. So that's what he's just spoken about. He says, but we have this treasure. So that's what he's just spoken about, which is the gospel, which, when proclaimed and understood by God's Spirit, it helps us see the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. It saves us, and we behold him. We come to faith in him. We are saved by him. He says that we have this treasure. So Paul looks at that gospel message and says, this isn't just a message, this is a treasure. This is something to be treasured. This is something to be loved and cherished because it's such good news. It's such good news. He says we have this treasure in jars of clay. Jars of clay in Paul's day, that was a common metaphor, biblically and actually culturally, for weakness. For weakness. See, Paul doesn't say we have this treasure in solid titanium safes. No, he says we have this treasure in jars of clay. And the jars of clay, he says, I'm the jar of clay. And the rest of us are the jar of clay. The preachers are the jars of clay. Now, Paul says that very deliberately. He says that to show that, and the reason he says that is he says to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. So you can look at Paul and you can look at the others and you can see weak vessels. Because these jars of clay, they weren't solid stuff. They could break easily. They get a little fragile. They could leak. They could, they weren't the most solid containers in the world. Probably the Tupperware in your kitchen would be more reliable than the jars of clay. And that's what Paul's saying. We are the jars of clay. But inside is the treasure. It's think of, we always joke about, at Christmas or a birthday, we joke about wee toddlers, getting this nice present and they just think, wow, look, a box, and they're excited by the wrapping. But as adults, we know that the real good stuff's on the inside. That's just, we rip that off and we throw it away. It's fragile, and it's kind of made to be fragile because it's what's inside that's the purpose. And it's the treasure is the gospel that they are bringing, in the sense they're carrying the gospel with themselves inside. But they said, we're just the weak vessels. And there's a reason, Jill mentioned how much she loves this passage. It's amazing the number of Christians I speak to. They say, I love that passage. I love that. I remember in our time in Torrey when we led a Bible study, and I said we were going to go through 2 Corinthians as a question and answer kind of Bible study. And one woman there who didn't say a whole lot actually during the Bible study said, oh, that's got my favourite passage. She says, and it was 2 Corinthians 4, because she says, treasures and jars of clay, because so often that's how we feel. Isn't it? That's so often how we feel. You just say, I'm such a weak Christian, or, I'm not good at bringing this message, or I just feel a bit exhausted, or I'm ill, or I don't feel powerful, I don't feel victorious a lot of the time. We can relate to that. And it's amazing that the Apostle Paul, who seems to us like and was just an amazing Christian, of course he was, but even he can say, I'm just a jar that kind of is a bit fragile and leaks from time to time, and sort of, but the real treasure's on the inside. And that demonstrates that surpassing power belongs to God, because if we were all strong and amazing all the time and super and powerful and all sorts of things, the glory might go to us, or people might get the wrong idea about the message of the gospel. And the message of the gospel is that it comes to those who know they need a Saviour, who know they need salvation. Not those who think they're great, not those who think they're the upstanding ones, but the ones who know they need Jesus. The power is all of God. It's not of Paul. And Paul doesn't want people to think that's the case. That's why I'm fragile. That's why I'm weak, because God, through me, demonstrates gospel. And when I say weak, I don't mean sinful. There's a difference there, isn't there? Between weak and sinful. Those aren't the same things. He's saying I'm weak, and I'm just a jar of clay. And he continues to talk about this suffering, having said the power belongs to God and not to us. And he gives that kind of list, doesn't he? Which is a bit of a paradox. And we understand this paradox, I think, in the Christian life. We understand this. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. Yeah, the things that come at us as Christians, and the things that come at us in our lives, we feel afflicted in every way, but we're not totally broken. We're not completely crushed. Perplexed, but not driven to despair. We may actually feel we're despairing. We're actually at that point, but Paul's saying we're not totally there. We're still clinging on. Our God's just sustaining us and keeping us going. Persecuted, but not forsaken. The martyrs that down the centuries of the church, even when they went to death, they were not forsaken by God. God was with them, even in that moment. Struck down, but not destroyed. And Paul will give more of those seeming contradictions, but actually just paradox later on when he talks about being sorrowful yet always rejoicing. those kinds of things. As a Christian, we get that, don't we? Because it doesn't make sense, but there is a sense in which we are, in our life and in our fallen world, we get battered around, but because we have Christ, we're not ultimately destroyed. And we know that ultimately we will be with him forever. We cannot be destroyed. Even if our bodies are destroyed, we go to be with Christ. He says, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may always be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our mortal flesh. See, here's the thing. If the apostles were people who didn't suffer, or who didn't get persecuted, or who didn't have difficulty in the Christian life, would you look at them and say, they're Jesus people? Probably not, because Jesus suffered beyond what anyone else has had to endure on the cross. And he called people to take up their cross and come and follow him. So I think there's a sense in which the death of Jesus is manifested in their bodies, in that they suffer and they're beaten around and they're persecuted because of Jesus, because they belong to Jesus. And so people can look at them and see the death of Jesus there, but there's also the life of Jesus in them. Because there's, first of all, the spiritual life that's raised Jesus from the dead. Sorry, raised them, through Jesus. They've been raised from the dead as well. But also God, Jesus has delivered them from so many things. They've been persecuted, but they've also been delivered from so many trials. The life of Jesus is at work in them. And so there's a sense in which people can look at them and say, I see both death and life in you. I see you being persecuted. I mean, struck down and perplexed, or all those different words. But at the same time, there's a Christ-likeness in you. And I see the life of Jesus in you. I see that in what you're saying and in what you're doing and what you're preaching. You're clearly of Jesus. But you're like Jesus in your life and not just in your words, because you're suffering like he did. You know, there's something amazing about that. There's a reason people outside of the church are not compelled or don't look at the sort of jet plane jimmies that fly around the world and steal everyone's money, especially with poor people, claiming it in the name of Jesus. And there's a reason people look at that and say, that doesn't seem very much like Jesus. If that's not gospel-like, that's not Christ-like, that's not what Jesus, flying around in comfort with however many mansions and, charlatans stealing fake healings, whatever the case may be. They don't look at that and go, wow, there's look at them carrying about the death of Christ in their jet planes. No one has ever said that. Nobody says that. They look at that. That might appeal, but it appeals for the wrong reasons. It doesn't appeal because you can look at that man and say he's like Jesus. And it reminded me this week of when I was in Romania. I was about 18. Excuse me. And we went to this. I was volunteering at a foundation for a few months. I was only there a few months, but we went to this. I guess you would call it an orphanage. Would be what you call it. It was part of the foundation we were at, and it was different though, because in this place, they were adults physically, but they were the ones who suffered the worst under communism, under Ceausescu, abandonment, all those kind of things. So I remember sitting with a 25-year-old man who wanted to play with dolls with me because they just hadn't had that nurturing, they hadn't had that kind of thing. And I remember being in there thinking, this is just a different place. And my friend who went there quite regularly, he was at the foundation, but he wasn't actually a Christian. And he said something to me that will never leave me. Of all this group, there was this one guy, I think he was in his 20s, and he says, he wants to talk to you because I told him you want to be a pastor. And I said, all right. So he was translating because my Romanian was absolutely shocking. I couldn't communicate anything. So he helped. This guy was fluent, so he helped me translate between us. And this man's dream was to be I don't know whether that was realistic or not, but his dream was to be a Baptist pastor. He said he wanted to be a Baptist pastor. And amongst all these people, he was a genuine Christian, clearly a Christian. And my friend told me, do you know he leads a Bible study every week with these people? He leads a Bible study and he sits down and he does this. And, these people who basically have the maturity of a child, he sees his ministry as being to these people. And he said something to me. He says, you know what? He says, if your God is real, he's with that guy. He says, he's with that guy. And this was an atheistic guy who said, I used to believe in God, I don't now. And he can cope with that. And of all the other things he'd seen, this guy who he loved, he said, I've never met any man like this. And he the guy wasn't, he wouldn't have been the most eloquent or the most intelligent or the most any of those kind of things. He says, whoever your God is, he's with that guy. And I think I hope that doesn't leave me till the day I die, because we need to remember that the gospel is different. And the way it works is different. And when it comes to Paul and the others, a lot of people looking in are saying, how are you God's people? And he says, no, this is why we're God's people. We carry about the death of Jesus so that you can see that in us, and the life of Jesus, so that you can see Jesus having raised us from the dead. And as we proclaim that message, you can receive life too. And so he said, this is who we are to be. This is who we have to be. And this is how Paul feels fragile and weak, manifesting the death of Christ wherever he goes, carrying out that about in his body, but he also carries the life of Jesus and that message of life, that message of hope, and that message of truth. And so we may too feel weak. We don't go through what Paul goes through, or I certainly haven't. We may feel weak, fragile, leaky jars. Sorry, I can't stop using that phrase. But we, in the sense that we may feel that way. But God, maybe the death of Christ is at work in us. And when people see that sometimes, but they see us holding on to our faith and still proclaiming that message, and they see the life of Jesus in us, that's a powerful, powerful witness. That's what he says in verse 12. So death is at work in us, but life in you through our preaching and our witness and our ministry, through all of these things. Paul has that perspective on his suffering. And maybe in the midst of yours today, God may use that to bring life to someone, the life of Christ in someone's life as they see you going about your day and even in suffering and even in pain, holding on to Jesus and remembering the gospel and bringing that to others. So we've seen something of Paul's suffering. And in the midst of that suffering, we see Paul's motives in verses 13 to 15. Paul's motivation to keep going, because if anyone needed a perspective that's going to keep them going, it's the Apostle Paul. It's the Apostle Paul. He needs that more than anyone. We've seen Paul's perspectives on his sufferings, but here's his motivations. He says, since we have the same spirit of faith, according to what has been written, I believed and so I spoke. We also believe and so we also speak. As I said earlier, that's a quote from Psalm 116, verse 10. And David obviously reflecting throughout that psalm. And he's giving thanks a lot, but he's also reflecting on times of affliction and adversity, thinking of how God had delivered him from trials. And here Paul uses the phrase to say, God has delivered us from so many trials. I believed and so I spoke. We also believe and so we also speak. So it's as if he's saying, like David, despite the trials, despite all that, we have seen God's deliverance. We have seen God at work in us. And so we continue to speak. We believe. The more God delivers us from these trials, far from preventing us from preaching, it actually shows us that God is with us and that God is at work in us and God is rescuing us and God is speaking through us. It's like you can't keep a good apostle down, can you? You know, they attack him and they go for him and he just keeps on getting up and going on again. It's like we've seen this work in our lives and we've seen what he's done, and so we believed and so we speak. And we bring that same message to you. It actually motivates us because we've seen God deliver us. How infuriating for Paul's enemies. Every time they think, we'll give him another lash and that'll be him down. It's like, nope, just keeps going and keeps preaching the gospel. When you have a heavenly perspective, that's really hard to stop. It's really hard to stop. People have tried to crush the church for centuries and have failed miserably. And we're still here in Stonehaven preaching the gospel and of all other places. Because Paul just can't be kept down. And the others, the great saints down the years, can't be stopped. We also believe and we also speak. So we keep speaking, knowing that he who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and bring us with you into his presence. Isn't that wonderful? That's the thing that keeps Paul going. It's looking ahead. It's looking to the future. So often the case for us, isn't it? If we look around at our current circumstances, we look around at our lives sometimes, we think our perspective gets skewed and we just think, I can't see anything. I can't see any good here. And maybe you can't right now, but looking forward, you can. Looking forward, we can see. Looking to being raised with Jesus. He who raised Jesus, we have that guarantee, because Jesus is raised from the dead, we know that, well, we are raised in a sense already. We are in a way already raised and seated with Christ. and we'll be brought into his presence. Again, we'll be ultimately raised. It's a wonderful knowledge, and he's saying that to the Corinthians too. I mean that for you too. As Christians, it's not just the apostles, Christians, be raised with him. Helps us to look upwards, look forwards, look beyond the kind of fog of our day-to-day lives at times and see there's something greater ahead. Even in the midst of this pain, that's what I got to look forward to. Jesus is there, ascended, seated on high, interceding for me. I'm united to him by faith. I'm going to be with him forever. So that's why Paul can keep going. That's why he can face all those things that he lists later on in this book. Because I will be raised, you will be raised, we'll be together with him in glory. It says, so it's all for your sake, so that as grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. See, this is another one of Paul's, what motivates him. He's seen God deliver from trials. He knows what's coming in the future. He's going to be raised with Jesus and get into his presence. And also, he just wants to see more people get in on this. More people get in on it. There's a church whose sermons I listen to in the States, and they have this mantra, the church, and it's a little bit corny, but it's brilliant at the same time. Where they stand, it's a gospel. I say mantra, they don't mean they like do mantras every week. You understand? It's just a statement they make about them as a church, and it says, step one, I'm a total idiot. He says, step two, my future is really bright. Step three, anyone can get in on this. I thought, what a brilliant description of the gospel. Not description of the gospel, but the results of the gospel, you know. And they're this big church, gospel church out in Nashville somewhere, but really Christ-focused people. But they have that mindset, just anyone can get in. It's like, come on in. And that's kind of what the gospel is, and that's what Paul wants for these people. He says, it's all for your sake, so that as grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. That's what motivates Paul. Seeing grace extend and go to more and more people. More and more people come to salvation in God, increasing in thanksgiving to God's glory. So it has that dual thing of people getting saved, God gets glorified. That's really Paul's motivation. And it got me thinking about myself and us as a church and what we're doing here in Stonehaven. These should be our motivations, right? We're not Paul, but this is what we're about, isn't it? That's why we keep going. That's why we persevere. That's why we continue to minister day to day in the mundane, in the normal, sharing Christ with people. Because we've had that salvation, like Paul, we've believed, and so we speak. We've seen God working us throughout our lives. We know Jesus is alive. He's raised. We're raised with him, and we will be with him. And we want other people to experience this. We want other people to know God's grace, to be saved, so that God gets the glory. Saved souls, God gets the glory. That's what we're about at this church. We want people to experience this. We see the souls of Stonehaven being saved, so that God gets the glory. That's a good thing to be as a church, and that's what we are to be. We are just the jars of clay. We're just the shaky, fragile people. Sorry if I keep calling you these things. I'm speaking primarily of myself, but I think you can relate to those feelings. I don't think it's just me. The real treasure is the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ, and people getting to see that. It's not about us and our power, but about God and his glory. That's what keeps us going. That's what motivates us. Even when we do feel like giving up. Because we do sometimes from time to time, or I do from time to time, when I lose perspective. Let's talk about Paul's motivations. And finally, Paul's mindset. Paul's eternal mindset in verses 16 to 18. So we do not lose heart. You know, he's used that phrase already, hasn't he, back in 4 verse 1. It's like he has to keep reminding himself and reminding them of we don't lose heart. And here's why. We can persevere. We do not lose heart. This is Paul's mindset, his eternal mindset on his life and ministry in the midst of adversity. We do not lose heart because in verse 16, though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. This 2 Corinthians is full of these seeming paradoxes and things where on the one hand this is happening, but on the other hand this is happening in Paul's heart and his life. So our outer self is wasting away. Can you relate to that as well? It happens sometimes. I I'm still a young man. I like to think I'm still a young man, and but I'm noticing when I get back from runs, I get a lot more twinges than I used to, and I'm only 31. I'm going to be 32 this month, so I'm beginning to get a little bit concerned. But, we all have those moments, don't we? We're just, outwardly we're wasting away, and that can happen for different reasons. That can have just time, just age, or just pain can take it out of you. Suffering ages us, doesn't it? It makes us, it wears us down, it exhausts us. Living in a fallen world, dealing with our own sinful flesh, dealing with the evil one and everything that's going on. We get worn out. Everybody gets worn out. It's exhausting. It's draining, and we waste away. Just imagine the Apostle Paul. We can't see Paul, and I sometimes think that's a shame, because sometimes if we see Paul, well, it's a shame, I don't know, but when you see Paul, think of the scars he bore on his back from all those lashings. He actually says to the Galatians, "I bear on my body the scars of the marks of Jesus Christ." He says, I know what it is to do that. He would have been worn out, times of hunger, times of distress, jail sentences, shipwrecks. I remember hearing a preacher say, I can't believe he was in one shipwreck and then got on another one. He says, if I was to go on a shipwreck, get shipwrecked, I'd never go on a ship again, but he wanted to get the gospel to people. And all of those things, he would have felt battered and bruised. But through all of it, the inner self is being renewed day by day. As he experiences those outer pains and difficulties, the inner self is being strengthened, is being renewed, spiritually built up and sanctified and made stronger even through those experiences. There's this total contrast between the outer, and it's not that the physical's bad, because God made the physical's good. But inward, but we can get bruised and battered and beaten around. We face illness, face all kinds of things. But the inner self is being renewed and strengthened day by day, even because of those things. It's in the Christian life, there's a sense in which you can't lose. You can't be being strengthened all the time, even in the midst of your suffering. God is not wasting that. It's not like God gets that and goes, I don't know what to do with this. No, God's sovereignly at work in that. He's bringing about his purposes. And so for Paul, he says, I'm being inwardly renewed and strengthened day by day. It says 17, for this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Do you think it's fantastic that Paul can have such a perspective and such a mindset that all of the stuff he's been through, he can say, this light momentary affliction, that he can say that about the lashings and the shipwrecks and the sleepless nights and the beatings and the stonings and whatever else he's gone through. I have things that don't even come close to being an affliction that I would consider a tragedy in my life when they happen. Something goes wrong during my day, you think a relative had died or something, whereas Paul just has this, oh yes, these shipwrecks, that's a light momentary affliction, and this persecution and this lashing, it's a light momentary affliction. How can that be a light momentary affliction, Paul? Please sit down and explain that to me. And Paul would say, well, it's because of what's to come, because it's preparing us for something that you can't even compare that stuff with, for preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Because when we get to glory and we experience the beauty and the glory of Jesus, we're not going to be sitting around thinking about, yeah, but Jesus, there was that few days back then when things weren't going so well. We're going to be so captured by the glory of Christ that we're not even thinking about that time. It's going to be gone. The pain will have been taken away. Well, we might think about that time, I don't know, but when we look back on it, we'll look back on it with the right perspective and the right eyes and be able to say, this was what I was being prepared for. Be more and more prepared for that day when I would be with Christ. It is an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. With Romans 8:18, where Paul also says, for I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. I want to be careful there and not say, it's not that God's minimizing people's suffering. It's not that he doesn't care about that, and it's not that I certainly don't want to do that for anyone, because there's nothing worse when people do that and make you feel as if this terrible thing that's happened isn't really all that bad. That's not what I'm trying to say, but what he's saying is in comparison to what's to come, an eternity in glory, it's far outweighs that. It's beyond comparison. So Paul can think of it in those terms. He says, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. Doesn't that describe just one of the greatest challenges of the Christian life? How do we even do that, Paul? I look at things that are seen. How am I supposed to look at things that are unseen? That's infuriating, Paul. But we know the truth of that, don't we? We're looking not with physical eyes at what's unseen, but we're looking because we know the truth. In our hearts, we see the truth of the gospel. We see the unseen things, the things that no one else looks at and that other people don't take encouragement from, and the things that perspectives that other people don't have. Says, no, we look to the things that are seen, but not to other way around, you know what I mean. We're looking at things unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. So the things that we see and experience just now, and again, we're not being dismissive of those things. You know, we have so many good gifts from God and things He has given us here. All good things come from the Father of lights, with whom there is no shadow due to change. You know, He gives us all these things. But we know that the things in this life are passing, and that Christ is going to return here, and He's going to dwell with us here in the new heavens and the new earth and this new creation where it's all going to be as it should. And so we bear that in mind. For Paul, if he just looked at what we could see around him, he'd be destroyed. He wouldn't be able to keep going. Who would be able to keep going with all that was going on in Paul's life? But when he looks beyond that, he looks to what's unseen. And when he thinks about what Christ has promised him and what's to come in eternity, the things that are unseen, we do not lose heart. We keep going. We press on. We don't give up. There is an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. It was Paul's eternal mindset. Changes everything, doesn't it? When we think that way, we so often get caught up in the here and now without thinking about the eternal. So, how is your perspective this morning on life and your situation, your circumstances, or your suffering perhaps? Again, a lot of that hurts. A lot of it's painful. Our current situations can be really traumatic and difficult and crushing. That's why Paul can say it. Paul's not standing up there as like, oh, just get over it. Paul's like, no. I'm crushed, but not completely crushed. Destroyed, not nearly destroyed, but not quite. So he knows this, as does Jesus. Jesus suffered. He knew what was coming, but it was still painful. It was still difficult. It was still. He still cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he still prayed, and whatever the sweat and drops of blood in the Garden of Gethsemane, and that stress and that anguish he went through, he knows what that is. That's the great Savior that we have, not some aloof, kind of far off God who doesn't care. We have one who stepped in as one of us and has lived and died for us. But sometimes we can lose perspective. Sometimes we feel like just giving up on witnessing, giving up on speaking to people about Jesus. Sometimes we just feel like giving up on our Christian life because it would be easier not to be a Christian at this point. That can happen when we lose sight of what is most important. Paul suffered greatly, and what kept him going was that eternal perspective. Keeping his mind on what is to come. Yes, they suffered. Yes, they were weak. They felt like dead men at times. They even said that in the first chapter, dead men. But Christ didn't let them go. He sustained them. He delivered them. Because of that, because of the way they mirrored Christ in their lives, people saw Christ in them. These fragile jars of clay, he saw it in them. It just pointed all the more to God and showed that it's of God, it's not of man, it's of his power. Their motive was always to preach Christ to the lost, that God may be glorified. At times we need to be reminded today, don't we, of eternity. As we minister, as we live, as we go on and go about our day-to-day, we must look to the things unseen, even in the day-to-day, even when we're in the office. Maybe especially when we're in the office, we need to look to the things unseen. When we're on the bus, when we're at the shops, there's more to it than this. And God has us here. We need to fix our eyes on what is to come, on the eternal, on Christ himself, knowing that we have a great and incomparable glory that awaits us. Amen. Let's close again by worshipping and singing together, when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll.